Welcome to Rewatch-and-Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode, before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is Grey's Anatomy Season 1, Episode 2. The first cut is the deepest. With our episode in a nutshell, we give a 1 to 2 line summary of exactly what happens within this episode. A woman comes in who bit her attacker's penis off. Then he comes in too. Izzy helps an undocumented immigrant outside of the hospital, and Meredith saves a baby when she steals a case from pediatrics. In the episodes scene by scene, we're going to go through each scene more detailed with more detailed summaries and provide opinions on those scenes. Meredith enters the locker room and puts a roommate notice on the bulletin board, while George and Izzy and Christina also arrive in the locker room. The interns then get changed into scrubs, and the camera focuses on Meredith putting leopard print shoes into her locker. Meredith interviews another intern about becoming her roommate, but then she says she doesn't think she's a good fit, as she's very particular about who lives in her house. The intern says that she's quiet, she doesn't play music or have parties, but Meredith says no, simply because of her age. In this case, she isn't looking for a friend, but a roommate. If they're quiet, if they don't play music, if they don't throw parties, that's an ideal scenario. I don't see why age should be the reason that she doesn't stay with someone. Plus, if they're also an intern, just like she is, then the age gap wouldn't be that huge unless she really delayed her education, which I don't think in the series is the premise, that she delayed her education for several years. So I'm really not sure why she would say no to this particular roommate. Agreeing with me, she put up posters for roommates if she doesn't actually want to have a roommate. Meredith says she does want a roommate, but not George and Izzy, as they're already together 100 hours a week. Christina interrupts, commenting on Meredith having a coffee for Bailey, calling it a bribe, which Meredith denies. George makes a case to be Meredith's roommate, saying he can put down first, last, and deposit, but she doesn't think it's a good idea. Izzy tries to make her case as well, saying she cooks and is an obsessive cleaner, but Meredith says no to her as well. Meredith says she just wants two strangers who she doesn't have to talk to or be nice to, before reiterating it's not a bribe, but a mocha latte as Bailey arrives to assign their daily tasks for the shift. George is assigned to go on the code team. Meredith is the trauma pager. Christina is to deliver labs, and Izzy is to do sutures. As Bailey leaves, Meredith approaches with the latte, asking to assist in the OR, and the others pile on, so Bailey scolds them, saying every intern wants their first procedure, but that it isn't their job. Their job is to make the resident happy, and she isn't happy. What will make her happy is if they do the task she's assigned them. She then takes the mocha latte and leaves, saying they won't hold a scalpel until she is happy. Christina mumbles to Meredith, and Bailey pauses on the stairs to ask why they're standing there, telling them to move. This goes back to my previous point on the previous slide. As I said, Izzy agrees with me. She puts up a sign for roommates. People apply to be her roommate, but because they aren't her friends or people that she can see becoming her friends, she says no. She says she wants strangers she doesn't have to talk to or be nice to. Yet, when there is someone who is quiet, who doesn't play music, who doesn't have parties, who would be a ghost in her house, she says no because of meaningless things like an age gap. And I also really like that Bailey declines the bribe. But then she takes the bribe anyways. She takes the coffee and she goes. And also, it's kind of rude for the other interns to crowd on in on Meredith's wanting to go into the OR. She brought a bribe. None of them brought a bribe. So I don't know why they're piling on if they didn't have the foresight to bring a bribe. Not that the bribe worked, but still, Meredith at least brought something to bribe with. None of them did, and yet they're piling on saying, well, if she gets to, I should too. I don't see your bribes. Meredith arrives at the elevator to find that Derek is also waiting for the same elevator. He makes a comment that Seattle has ferry boats, which he loves, but he didn't know about it even after living there for 6 weeks. Meredith points out that Seattle is surrounded by water on 3 sides, and then they get into the elevator and they are the only ones in it. He says he's from New York and supposed to hate everywhere else, but he has a thing for ferry boats, and now he has to like it there. When the doors close, Meredith says she won't go out with him, even though he didn't ask. Derek says he never asked her to go out with him, before asking if she does want to go out with him. She says she won't date him or sleep with him since he is her boss and teacher, and then says he's harassing her, and she is drawing a line. Derek asks if the line is imaginary or if she needs a marker. They hold eye contact until Meredith jumps him, dropping her folders, and they make out until the doors open again. Meredith picks up her folders and leaves quickly, while Derek calls after her, asking if they'll talk later. Again, this couple has very good chemistry on screen. But Meredith, she brings up, I'm painting a line, and then she's the one who crosses it immediately after she supposedly drew it. And we wonder why he keeps chasing. Because she gives mixed signals every time. Her mouth will say, I don't want to date you. I don't want to be with you. I'm drawing a line. And then the next second she flips and is like, actually, I'm crossing that line that I drew. And he, of course, that's what he wants. So he's not going to say anything about it. But if you're drawing a line, maybe you should have maybe at least stay on the other side of the line for, like 24 hours or even like 2 minutes. Might be an idea. So Meredith arrives at the trauma room where a nurse is there and gives her a rundown on the current status of the victim. The victim has major injuries, and Meredith happens to notice that the victim's shoes are the same ones she wore that day to work and put in her locker in that first scene. She stops listening, zoning out, until a nurse finally gets her attention again, and then she does snap out of it and start giving orders for the tests to determine the status of the victim. I understand that the shoes are plot device to basically have Meredith over empathize with the victim in this story, but it is weird that she's so hyper focused on shoes. Shoes of all things. And you will see in future scenes, she's very hyper focused on these shoes. And I understand the plot device that they are being used as to draw that connection, to hyper empathize, but I don't personally get the deal with the shoes. While performing surgery with Burke, Derek says she'll spend a lot of time in recovery and also in rehab, saying after what this guy did to her, if they find him, they should castrate him. Burke notes that she fought back based on her shredded hands, with Derek adding she won as her kit was negative. Burke says they have a warrior among them, but Meredith corrects that her name is Allison. Burke then pulls out the cause of the rupture in her internal organs, but doesn't know what it is. Meredith, somewhat in awe, replies that she bit it off, and it's a penis. And Burke drops it in a tray as quickly as he possibly can. Obviously, there was good foreshadowing in the script. If we find him, we should castrate him. Too late, the victim, Allison, already did. And I also find it very amusing that Burke, being a doctor, has to throw the penis away as quickly as possible. He can't stand it. It's funny. After the surgery, Derek and Burke discuss Allison's state and her potential for recovery. Derek pointing out that she needs to wake up in the next 72 hours to have any chance. Burke then invites Derek to get a drink later so Derek can tell him why he left New York, to which Derek replies that there's nothing to tell as Richard made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Burke is surprised, confirming Richard asked him to come, and Burke becomes awkward as Derek leaves the room. So this is the first time we've really seen the attendings interacting with each other rather than residents or interns. But other than that, self-explanatory scene. While sitting over by a counter in a little office space, George brags to Christina about being on the code team. But she tells him not to say another word until after Bambi shoots his mother. And he tells her he doesn't like her. She lists off her credentials before saying with all those credentials, she's stuck delivering labs, noting it'll take her all day to get through all of them. Bailey overhears her as she arrives, trailed by Alex, and tells her she should get started then. Christina tries to say she wasn't complaining, but Bailey overrides her, saying an intern was reassigned and has him shadow her for the day. She tells Christina to show Alex how she does things. Alex and Christina comment that he's the one who called. So he introduces himself as Alex, and Christina then comments that he's the one that called Meredith a nurse. And she hates him, on principle. And Alex says she's the pushy, overbearing kiss ass, and he hates her too, as he follows her away to go with her to deliver the labs. Now, I mentioned in the last episode that I don't like George, and I really don't. Alex, he starts dislikable, but he grows on you. He's somebody who will eventually have his redemption arc and eventually become someone who's more likable. So I have a lot more forgiveness for his rudeness at this point, and I do feel a little bad for him that he ended up being reassigned after the last episode where he was letting his ego rule. Also, one of the best and most memorable lines, I think, in the entire series is the Bambi line. I think it really suits George being called Bambi, and it definitely tells you who Christina is when she tells him not to say another word until after Bambi shoots his mother. Just after Christina and Alex leave, George's pager beeps, and he runs along a corridor followed by the code team. He then begins to run his first code of the day. Meanwhile, Izzy greets a Chinese woman, Ms. Liu, who needs stitches. She starts speaking to her in her own language, which Izzy doesn't understand, and then Izzy tries to ask if anyone else in the area speaks Chinese, but she gets no reply. Now, I'm not sure if it works the same everywhere, but I believe most hospitals have a translator service that they can call in the case of a patient who doesn't speak the native language of that country. I'm not sure why that wouldn't be her first thought, rather than like asking random strangers who she can't really rely on to be effective translators. Like if they're not a professional translator, one, why would they? And two, they could lie. I don't see why they would lie, but it's always a possibility. If there is an official service available, like a translation service, that really should be what she's going to first. Unless there is another doctor on staff who may speak the language, in which case maybe that doctor should take over rather than just being a translator. But it is odd to me that she didn't immediately go to a service rather than just randomly looking around the room going, anybody speak this language? Meredith arrives at Richard's office and speaks to Patricia, who is his secretary assistant, who asks if she can see it. Then she looks at the cooler, second guesses herself, and tells her to forget she asked. Richard then comes in and greets Meredith, asking about what her mother is up to. Meredith awkwardly says that she's taking some time off before holding up the cooler to change the subject. She tells Richard that she was told to bring it to him, and Richard confirms that it's for the police. He then turns to Patricia and asks when the police are coming. Patricia comments that the police are very slow, And then she says that Meredith should take it with her since all medical matter must stay with the person who collected it until it is placed into police custody. These are the chain of custody rules. Meredith then asks what she's supposed to do with a penis, and Richard is left speechless with no response. Now I know she's saying, what is she supposed to do with a penis? But it's in a cooler. A cooler is a very ordinary object. It could hold her lunch, it could hold anything. Unless she tells people that it's a penis, no one's going to know it's a penis. So she literally just has to walk around with the cooler. And from what I can see from the rest of the episode, or what I remember from the rest of the episode, it doesn't really cause any sort of hassle to have a cooler next to her and just take it and set it down wherever she happens to be. Also, it says chain of custody rules. The person who collected it has to stay with it until police custody. So I'm wondering why it's not Burke walking around with the cooler, since he is the one who collected the sample from the body, because he was the one operating. Why it has to be an intern. That's just something that I feel like was a bit of an oversight, in that they say the one who collected the sample specifically should be carrying it and keeping it with them, and Burke is technically the one who collected it, as he's the one who pulled it out of the body during the surgery. Meanwhile, Christina and Alex are giving lab results to a family and the patient that he will be discharged that day and there was nothing seriously wrong with him. This leads to a woman hugging Christina, who glares at Alex, who smirks at her. Christina looks so bad, like she wants to run away, and I never would consider, even if I was really happy, hugging a stranger doctor I have never met before. I don't know if this is actually a thing, or if people just don't respect other people's personal spaces. But if somebody I loved was a patient and I got good news, I would hug them. I wouldn't be hugging the doctor. The doctor did nothing. They're just, well, obviously they found out what was wrong and then gave the good news. But I mean, like, as far as, like, they're just delivering results. They just did their job. They didn't do anything beyond what their job entails. Let me say it that way instead. So they did their job. That's what they're supposed to do. Why am I hugging them for doing their job? If I get good news about somebody I love or care about being in a better state or not as sick as we thought, I would hug the patient. I would hug my family member. But it seems to be a running theme in this episode that patients don't know personal space, and I don't know if I'm the odd one out in that I would never hug a stranger doctor, or if that's actually normal. And somebody in the comments let me know, is that actually normal for people to hug their doctors? And not even their doctors, but just a random doctor who gives them good news? I feel like maybe extroverts might. I'm not an extrovert though, so I never would. Meredith joins George in the little office space that they have at the hospital. She places the cooler on the counter and he asks what it is. And she tells him he doesn't want to know what it is. But he says that he really, really wants to know. So she tells him, and he instantly regrets wanting to know. Christina and Alex walk by, and Christina complains about being hugged all the time, and Alex says it's because she's an ovarian sister, offending Christina, who asks when the possession of ovaries became an insult. George then points out that Meredith is carrying a penis around. Christina takes a look, saying, "Talk about taking a bite out of crime," and leaves. George asks Meredith if she's okay, and she brings up having the same shoes as Allison. George says he knows that what she needs, but she refuses, saying that they'd get in trouble if they were found out. But he says she can come with him, or she can be miserable. This scene kind of goes into that shoe thing again. And again, I don't understand the shoe thing. I understand the plot device reason for it, but I don't think it really works because it's unrealistic that someone would care that somebody has the same mass-produced shoes that they have. Just in general, in reality, I don't think people are looking at people's shoes and going, "Oh my gosh, We must be twins because you have the same mass-produced Walmart shoes that I have. Now, I don't know where she got her shoes from, but obviously they're mass-produced. If other people are walking around in them, they're not one of a kind. So the assumption would be that, yes, other people have the same shoes that I do. Also, it didn't come through much in the summary as well, but when George is saying that he knows what Meredith needs, they talk about it almost like they're talking about something illegal, something like drugs or illicit substances like alcohol or things like that, when we already know that that's not what it is. But I do think it was clever of them to make it seem that way as the showrunners, like to make it seem that way because then it makes people guess. And they've already shown that these doctors are not necessarily the most um, moral or ethical doctors that have ever existed. So for all we know, that could actually be what they were going to go and do. Now we find out what George and Meredith were actually talking about as they stand in front of the nursery and they look at the babies. While they're looking at the babies, George's pager beeps that there's a code, so he ends up leaving. Meredith continues looking at the babies and notices that one baby's face has started to go blue. She looks around, but not seeing anybody around, she goes in and checks on him. As she's checking on him, a peds nurse walks in and aggressively asks Meredith what she's doing there. And she asks her why no tests were done as the baby has a murmur. The intern says she knows, but Meredith asks if she's going to do any tests, telling her that the baby turned blue. The intern says it's benign. Meredith asks if she's sure. She says she's a doctor too, and then kicks Meredith out. This scene, it is poor behavior because it's not her service. It's not a patient of hers that she's checking on. But as a doctor, I feel like if you did see somebody turning blue, regardless of whether it was your patient or not, you would go in and check on them. I feel like that would be your natural instinct if you're a good doctor. So I don't really have anything negative to say about Meredith in this case. I think what she did in this part of the story was a good thing. She went in and checked on a baby turning blue. She raised the necessary concerns. Unfortunately, the person she raised the concerns to isn't one that actually is going to take those concerns seriously, which is what leads to the other events that later happen in the episode. So Izzy is sitting in the suture lab, waiting, and then Christina comes in. Izzy tells Christina that she can't get in touch with the translator and asks if she can speak to Mrs. Liu, thinking that Christina will know Chinese. Christina points out that she is from Beverly Hills and the only Chinese she knows is from a Mr. Chow's menu, and then notes that even if that wasn't the case, she's Korean, not Chinese. She then leaves, mildly offended. So it's good to know that I was right about the fact that most hospitals would have a translator service so that if a patient comes in that doesn't speak the same language, you are able to assist them. However, it is kind of suspicious that that service wouldn't be 24 hours or readily available. Or why is Izzy just sitting around instead of continuing to try to get through? If they're on another call, hold on the line until somebody picks up, or keep calling back until somebody picks up. I don't think a translator service that a hospital uses when hospitals are 24 hours and an emergency could come in at any time would use a translator service that wasn't also 24 hours. So I'm sure if she kept trying, she would have been able to get through. And it's also kind of shitty of Izzy to assume automatically that just because Christina is Asian, that she is A, Chinese, and B, would even speak the language. These are the types of assumptions that you kind of want to avoid as a general rule, I would say. Burke corners Richard and asks Richard why. He asks Derek to come to Seattle Grace. Richard tells him it's because Derek is an old student of his. Burke then pushes, asking if there's absolutely no other reason, before stating that the chief of surgery position is his. Richard says he won't be leaving for a while, but Burke repeats that the chief of surgery is his. And Richard says it was his. Now he isn't sure. Burke starts listing his stats, but Richard interrupts, telling him to ask him why. He's not so sure. But instead of asking Richard why he's not so sure, Burke walks away. Now I understand Burke's a little bit hot-headed, that's why he walks away. But in all honesty, I would have asked why, if only so that I could then refute it and come up with a good argument for why he's wrong. Even if I walk away after asking why and I disagree with his answer, I would walk away. I would formulate an argument or a response or a counter to it, and then I'd come back later with that counter and be like, here's why I actually should still be. This is why you're wrong. This is why I don't agree with you. Instead, he leaves himself wondering by just walking away and not asking why. And I don't think that's the clever move, but I understand that he was a bit hot-headed and obviously offended in this scene. So walking away before you do something dumb, especially when it's your boss you're talking to, can also be argued to be a good choice. Christina and Alex are taking a break from delivering labs, when he asks how they will ever get OR time if everyone's going to just live. Christina splits the files, hands half to Alex, and tells him they need to get out. No hugging, no crying, no talking. He comments that she's the slow one, and they make a bet to see who can get done first delivering the labs. And then they leave. It then proceeds into a montage of them giving out lab results. It then shows George doing code runs. And then Meredith interviewing for roommates. And she says she wants strangers. She doesn't need to interact with, but all of her questions are about interacting with her roommates. And she's declining everyone who is coming to ask her. And all the while, the results montage continues, and George starts losing patience in the code team and starts looking more and more sad and tired. I don't have much to say on this scene. It's basically, like I said, a montage of them doing daily life things, of George doing his task for the day, and of Meredith interviewing roommates that she's going to decline for reasons that literally go against what she said she wanted. She didn't want to interact, but every question she asks is about interacting, and she's declining because she doesn't want to interact with these people, even though that's supposedly what she had asked for in the first place. Meredith watches Allison through the glass of her room when Derek comes over, saying that he's checked the neighboring hospitals and hasn't found the attacker, but eventually the attacker will need to seek medical attention, and when he does, she has the evidence with her to put him away. She asks where her family Meredith asks where Allison's family is, and Derek says that she had just moved to the city 3 weeks ago and doesn't have any family left as an orphan. Derek then asks Meredith if she's okay, and she says she's fine, but has to do something, and then leaves to go find Burke. When she finds Burke, she tells him about the baby that she saw turning blue, but he says that unless Peds asks for a consult, he's a busy man, and there are rules, snarking that it's not like he's the chief or something, before walking away from her. I agree. In this scene, I don't really have anything to say. I think in this case, is it a nice idea that Burke would go to another service and steal a patient? Maybe. But I feel like in reality, in order for a place like a hospital to function, the rules should be observed, and they haven't been requested for a consult, so he is right in declining her in this case, though his motivation for declining her is a little iffy because it's just that he's buttsore that Richard is now considering Derek potentially as his replacement as chief of surgery one day in the far future, rather than him. And that's his motivation. That's why he's getting snarky. So I agree with his decision to follow the rules because rules should be observed, but his motivation for doing so, a bit iffy. Meanwhile, we head back to Izzy, who's doing sutures on a drunk guy that recognizes her from her modeling days before she finishes him up and tells him to leave. Then Mrs. Liu comes over and continues to try to talk to her, but Izzy doesn't understand, so she says she really has to suture her and she begins to stitch up her arm. Mrs. Liu continues to try to reach out, but Izzy just keeps stitching without saying anything because she doesn't understand. And at this point, it's been a while and she needs to do her job, which is to suture Mrs. Liu. Again, I'm going to point it out one more time. Why is she not continuing to try the translator service? She indicated when she brought Christina that she couldn't get a hold of them, but what, she tries once, gives up, never calls them again? She should continue to try. That service is there for a reason, for just this scenario. So she should be continuing to try, and it doesn't indicate, at least in the show, on the time that we see Izzy on screen, that she is doing so. So I'm not sure what the motivation to not keep trying to use the service that's available to her is. Christina comes in from the parking lot asking Meredith what she's doing and sitting in the lobby. Meredith says that she's sitting with her penis, asking the same of Christina, who says she's hiding from Alex. Meredith then brings up kissing Derek in the elevator because she's having a bad day, and Christina, in disbelief, repeats that this is what you do on your bad days, make out with McDreamy. And then Meredith says that she does that, and carrying around a penis makes things look so shiny and happy. Christina then mentions that George told her about the shoes, and Meredith asks if that is weird. And Christina agrees with me that it's weird. It's weird that she cares, and then a truck swerves into the parking lot and crashes. They then head outside to see a man with bloody pants stumble from the vehicle and collapse onto the ground. Multiple doctors and nurses rush around to crowd him, and Meredith calls for security while the attacker is wheeled into the hospital. Bailey then arrives, and Meredith tells her to take a look, and Bailey lifts the sheet, sharing a significant look with Meredith. Bailey then instructs Meredith to take him to OR1 and to inform Richard that they have him. Obviously, this is moving the plot along. We now have the attacker who hurt Allison, who we are supposed to care about because of shoes, mass-produced shoes, which again I think is weird. And then I do want to call out that it is the first time that we hear Derek referred to as McDreamy, which is a nickname that is going to stick going forward. So it's worth calling out that this is the first time that we hear a character call him that. Meredith and Christina observe the surgery of the attacker, and Bailey is the one who is performing the surgery. She then asks them why they don't reattach the penis, and Christina responds that they can't reattach without a clean cut, and teeth tear. They don't cut. Meredith then adds that Allison's digestive juices didn't leave much of the flesh to work with. Bailey then asks for his outlook, and Meredith says that he'll be peeing out of a bag for a long time, and Christina notes he won't be able to ever have sex again, calling it a shame, sarcastically. Bailey then sarcastically also adds that they should take a moment to grieve before asking for a clamp. I feel like Bailey and Christina, between the two of them, given their personalities in the show, as Christina's being a little bit harsh and Bailey's being completely no nonsense, that this scene is very entertaining to watch. And they are doing the surgery on the attacker, but it's clear that they aren't really caring much about his well-being or safety, obviously. As Richard is leaving an OR, Burke again finds him, and then he tells Burke that they have the attacker who stumbled right into the hospital. Burke said he heard, and then he asks why. Richard asks if he really wants to know, and Burke confirms that he wants to know when he stopped being his number one. He then goes on to say that he does more, but Richard interrupts him here, saying that he does only as much as necessary, never taking an extra step or giving an extra minute. He calls him comfortable and arrogant, telling him that if he wants to be the chief, he has to earn it. Then Richard walks away. Burke then looks over to Meredith, who is coming out of the other OR with the attacker, who then looks away from him, and then he leaves himself. Now, this kind of goes back to what I was saying before. Had he asked Richard why the first time, Richard would have told him. Then, when Meredith went to him with her concerns, he might have at that point, instead of just dismissing her out of hand or giving a sarcastic comment, which obviously made her feel uncomfortable that she's not even looking at him now, that maybe he would have helped. Maybe he would have taken that extra step at that time because he would have known that that's what Richard was looking for. But he didn't know that because he didn't bother to ask why. He just stormed off. But now he knows why and can take the appropriate actions going forward to change Richard's mind. Derek gazes at Allison, worried about her as she still hasn't woken up, and he sits in her room to monitor her. In the suture pit, Mrs. Liu's stitches are finished, but she's still continuing to try to communicate with Izzy. Izzy says that she has other patients lined up and she can't understand her, and she uses empathetic tones to say these things, but ultimately does send Ms. Liu out of the hospital before beginning to clean up her supplies. Again, these are just a couple of short little snippets. Derek worrying about Allison now that we have her attacker. We're now seeing the state again that she is in to be reminded of just how horrible of a person the attacker was. And then also with Izzy, who again still hasn't seemingly retried the translator service. And it's when the attacker came in, it was bright out, so it's during the day. If she kept trying, I'm sure she would have gotten hold of somebody. The fact that she isn't trying again, or staying on hold, or even having a nurse keep trying and then coming to her with a phone once they get through while she continues to help other patients, I honestly and genuinely do not understand why this was the creative choice made, because it's such an obvious solution. And I know what happens at the end of the episode is the whole point of this, but at the same time, I feel really bad for Mrs. Liu, who's basically being ignored, and they're not really doing anything to try to communicate with her effectively. Of course, had they done so, things may not have turned out as well for her as they do, because Izzy's more empathetic, but we'll talk on that when we get to those scenes. So the interns are gathering in their abandoned hallway filled with abandoned hospital beds. Alex is complaining that his head hurts, and Christina says that maybe it's a brain tumor. He says she wishes, and she confirms that she'd rip his face off if she got to scrub in on the surgery to put it back on. Izzy comes in and tells them her hands are numb from suturing all day. George says that at least she's helping people, while Alex says that at least she's practicing medicine. Izzy says that she had to send Mrs. Liu away, who is camped out down in the pit. Meredith then comes in and says that the police can't come for the penis for hours, so she has to spend the night with the cooler. George asks who has no idea what they are doing, and they all raise their hands except for Alex. They all complain about being an intern, and then Bailey comes in. She raises her hands at them without even saying anything, and they all jump up and return to their jobs. Once they're gone, Bailey takes their spot on the abandoned bed and eats a snack that one of them left. I believe they're Lay's chips. I am a little confused on why Bailey was, hands up. I would assume most doctors do get breaks. Unless there's like an emergency, they'll have a scheduled break, even if they're assigned to other tasks. Like if you're delivering labs, I'm sure you'd get your 15-minute breaks. You'd get your lunch hour. I don't think that those basics of those are your rights as a job, as a worker on a job. You have employee rights. And I'm pretty sure part of those rights are that you get breaks. So they should be allowed to be able to take a break down in those beds if they have been keeping up with their work. As long as their work isn't suffering, let them have their 15 minutes to complain and vent and socialize and have a bit of a break before going back to work. Meredith has returned to the nursery and she happens to see the parents of the baby that she's worried about. She goes over to them behind Pediatrics' back and shares her concerns. The pediatric intern then sees her talking to them and tells her that she's out of line before leaving to get her resident. Dr. K comes back with her and asks what's wrong, and the parents say that if their child is sick, they want him treated. Dr. K asks who told them their baby was sick, and the intern points out Meredith. When Dr. K asks who authorized her to be there, Bert comes up behind her and says that he did, before excusing them from the parents. He asks if the intern checked the baby and did the appropriate test, and if she's 100% sure that the murmur is benign. And the intern hesitates. Dr. K turns to her and asks how sure she is, and she says she's 75% sure. Burke says that the baby is on his service now and introduces himself to the parents, saying that they are going to run some tests and give them an answer within the hour. He then gives Meredith orders for which test she needs to run. And as I mentioned before, this is exactly somewhat what should have happened. Obviously, I think it would have been more appropriate for Dr. Burke to inform Dr. K and basically order him to do the tests, and then if they come back, then it would change service to surgery because he would have to do this procedure. But I would rather he had used his authority to just make sure that the appropriate service was taking care of the child properly and that they did the appropriate tests that they should have done, rather than completely stealing the patient. But as Dr. K does tell the intern, Burke's an attending. He has the right to come in and take those patients, something that Meredith did not have. Meredith, I understand her worry. I understand her wanting to take care of it. And I think going to the parents, it is wrong to go behind the original doctor's back, but if you genuinely have the knowledge and expertise to be able to tell that something may be wrong and you have heard straight from their mouths that they have not done the appropriate test to determine 100% whether or not that is the case, that it's not an issue or it is an issue, going to the parents so that they can advocate for their child, I think is a reasonable step. It's a rude step, but I don't think that that would be unethical or unmoral in any way, rather the opposite, because you're not stealing the patient, you're not going outside of the bounds of your job, you're just letting the parents know that, hey, you should be advocating for your child. This is something that could potentially be an issue. Maybe you should bring this up and go and advocate for yourselves. And I see nothing wrong with that. After suturing all day, Izzy goes up to the receptionist and asks if there's anybody else, and the receptionist tells her that the beds are clear, but then she notices that Mrs. Liu is still there. She's never left. Mrs. Liu beckons for her to follow her, and Izzy does follow her outside into the rain. When she follows her, she does find Anne, who has a big laceration on her forehead. Izzy says that she'll help, and she examines the laceration, determining that Anne needs stitches, and Anne explains that a machine broke in the factory and injured her. Izzy is relieved that at least one of them is now able to communicate with her, and she tells them to come inside, but Anne refuses, saying that she doesn't have a green card. And she is afraid that she will go to jail if she goes in. Izzy continues to try to convince her, saying they don't have to tell the hospital that she doesn't have a green card. They just need to go inside so that she can stitch her up. But After failing to convince them to come inside, Izzy then tells them to wait and promises to be back. Again, we have the moral versus legal or ethical argument. Obviously, you see somebody in help, you are a doctor trained to help, you want to help, so you plan to do so. However, this is obviously not a paying patient, and if you were doing it on your own time, that would be different, but she's still actively on her shift at the hospital. So if it's not a patient of the hospital, she really shouldn't be treating her. And this is where I go back to the last time where I mentioned if she had gotten in touch with the translation service, obviously the translation would have heard that Mrs. Liu wants them to help a patient outside of the hospital who is not have a green card, who does not have a green card, and they probably would not then have gotten help because there's no way that the hospital would have allowed that. So they kind of had to contrive it where Izzy doesn't follow the proper procedures and get attached with a service so that she can then follow Mrs. Liu and then find Anne and then be able to help her. Because otherwise, if they had had the translation service, that probably would not have happened. Back with Meredith, she catches up with Burke, who confirms that the baby in fact did have a birth defect, and she thanks him. But he turns to her and he warns her that while she was right, if she ever goes behind a doctor's back or tries to steal a patient from another service again, he will make her residency hell on earth. He then leaves her to go and speak to the parents. Meanwhile, George continues to run codes, Christina delivers results, and Izzy steals supplies while Derek continues to monitor Allison. They're small snippet scenes. Again, I semi-agree with Burke. Obviously, I don't think going to the parents was wrong because it gives them the opportunity to know that they need to advocate for their child. But stealing a patient from the other service, going behind those doctors' backs to him, those actions were a bit on the unethical side, I would say. And then, of course, also when we're speaking about ethics, is he stealing supplies? And especially looking so suspicious while she's doing so is obviously not a good thing. Now, we understand she's trying to do a good thing, but again, if it was her own supplies on her own time, I would see nothing wrong with it. But because she's using the hospital supplies on the hospital's time for a patient that is not going to be paying that hospital for that service, that's where you get into the muddy waters and the unethical nature, even though it's moral, not very ethical. Izzy stitches up On's forehead and says she could have done better with more light, but On says that it's good. She tells him to come back in 5 days so she can check on the wound and remove the stitches, confirming several times that they understand that they have to come back in 5 days. She then gives them her pager number, warning that they can't tell anybody she helped them outside of the hospital since she could lose her job. They leave and she cleans up her supplies when Mrs. Liu returns and thanks Izzy in her own language, and then she watches them walk off down the street together before returning back into the hospital. Again, this kind of shows that Izzy's character has a penchant for rule breaking. She doesn't respect the rules very much, but it's also, again, highlighting that what she is doing is potentially illegal. At the very least, she could lose her job if anybody found out. Taking that kind of risk for her morals, fair, but why didn't she wait till the end of her shift and do it on her own time? She's a licensed doctor. She would help. She would be able to stitch them up with her own supplies, provide her with the first aid care that she needed. Instead, she's stealing from the hospital. She's using the hospital supplies. She's risking her job. And that is a decision that she has made. So it really shows that she, at least as a character, doesn't really value the rules or will put her morals above her ethics. Burke comes up to Bailey, who's leaning over a railing, and asks Bailey if he's too confident. She says no, but he tells her not to lie, and then she points out to him that he's her boss. So then he tells her that anything that she says in the next 30 seconds is free. Bailey immediately starts listing the negative things about him, including that he's cocky, arrogant, pushy, has a god complex, never thinks of anyone but himself. Brooke tries to interrupt, but Bailey says that she's not done. Then, in the locker room, Christina complains that she needs a drink, a man, or a massage, or a drunken massage by a man. George, while messily brushing his teeth, says he lost 5 patients, and he feels like the angel of death. But Christina then informs him that most code patients are already dead before he gets there. He asks why she didn't tell him that when he was excitedly bragging about being on the code team, and she says, "Because you're George, and I'm Christina," before she leaves. Meredith is seen in a rocking chair in the nursery, and then the pediatric intern says that the baby's surgery is scheduled for the morning, before continuing that she really did think she was right. Meredith says that she knows, but that interns are almost never right, and when they are, it's completely shocking. The intern then asks Meredith if she feels, and Meredith fills in the word for her as terrified, and then says that she feels terrified all the time. And the intern says that she's glad it's not just her before she leaves. I feel like with Burke and Bailey, it's a matter of don't ask if you don't want an answer. And again, Bailey's bluntness and no-nonsense answers are very refreshing, and that makes her character very likable. In the locker room, George, I don't like George, but who is brushing their teeth and making that much of a mess? He had toothpaste all around his mouth. Like all around it. He was making a beard with this toothpaste. That's disgusting. And he's an adult. I mean, maybe a kid who like misses their mouth when they put this toothbrush in or something, but why is an adult making a beard with toothpaste on his face? It was absolutely disgusting. And then with Meredith and the intern, I think that it takes a big person to be able to admit faults, and an equally big person to accept that with grace and humility. In this case, the intern, she admits she was wrong. Everything has been forgiven. She's accepted her faults. She'll do better in the future. She's learned her lesson. And Meredith, rather than bragging about being right, about having basically corrected her mistake for her, instead empathizes with her, sympathizes with her, and they end up leaving on very good terms. And I think that that kind of humility, that kind of grace is actually very positive. And given my criticisms of the show, there are a lot of times where things maybe aren't like that. So it's refreshing to see a scene where people are communicating effectively and interacting with that grace and humility. Meredith comes over and asks Derek how Allison is doing, and he says that there's been no change. Derek then comments that he has 4 sisters, and if he was in a coma, they'd all be there around him. But having no one, he can't imagine it. Meredith replies that she can, and then he brings up her mother, and she hesitantly agrees that she would have her mother. He then changes the subject and says that they're kissing but not dating, and she replies she knew that was going to come up, and he continues that he likes the kissing, but if it's going to happen again, he needs to know so he can bring breath mints. She changes the subject, bringing up the baby in the nursery, wondering how people get from there to here, where she's wearing her shoes and someone's beat the crap out of her. Allison starts to crash, and Derek focuses on his patient, giving out orders to the staff. Meredith waits outside the surgery, and when Derek comes out, he tells her that he had to leave the skull flap off to deal with the swelling, and Meredith asks if she'll survive. He says that she'll be fine if she ever wakes up. Derek asks Later, Derek encounters Burke and asks if he wants to get that drink they talked about, and Burke tells him that Richard offered Chief to both of them, which Derek said he already knew, and he was keeping his enemies closer. Burke says that they won't be getting that drink, adding that he isn't an enemy, he's just the competition, and walks away. I feel a little bit bad for Derek. He keeps repeatedly getting declined by Meredith, rejected by Meredith, and now he's also rejected by Burke for drinks. He can't get a girlfriend, he can't make friends. This poor man is rejected by everybody. Back in Richard's office, Patricia helps Meredith sign over the paperwork to transfer the custody of the cooler into the police. Richard tries to say penis, laughing that it shouldn't be weird since he's a doctor, but that he used to change Meredith's diapers. Meredith hands the cooler to Richard, who then hands it over to the police. And it's a very short snippet scene. It does indicate a history between Meredith's mother and Richard, and that Richard knew her as a child. But apart from that, standard snippet. Burke is starting the surgery on the infant, and he's explaining the procedure to the room when he tells Meredith to go scrub in, and he'll let her hold the clamp. Meredith is surprised, asking if he's serious, and he tells her not to make him change his mind, and she goes. Derek storms into the attacker's room and wakes him up, saying he has good news and bad news. He tells him that Bailey stopped his bleeding, but his penis was given to the cops, and then he leaves. The attacker looks down at his wrist and realizes that he's cuffed to the bed. Christina and Alex give out more test results. Christina tells a patient that their tumor was benign, so they can go home. The patient hugs her husband, who then goes for Christina. Christina acts fast and shoves Alex into his way. Alex gets the hug, and Christina gets to leave feeling smug and pleased with herself. Burke operates on the baby while Meredith gets to hold the clamp. And ultimately, I would say that this is just wrapping up all of the cases and the tasks for the day. There isn't really any new information. I do kind of dislike that Meredith was rewarded for stealing the case. I mean, she's the one who saved that baby, so she should get to observe, but maybe don't reward her with getting to participate, because what she did ultimately was not necessarily the most ethical. And I do like that Christina gets her revenge on Alex, who was making fun of her for getting all the hugs, and now he's the one who gets the hug. But again, just wrapping up kind of all of the cases for the episode. Now we have all of the interns that are gathered looking at all of the babies in the nursery. Meredith then tells Izzy and George that they can move into her house. They're excited and start jumping around and hugging each other in the back, Izzy saying that she can't believe she caved. Meredith then turns to Christina more sedately and says that she can't believe she caved, and Christina says that she blames the babies as they make you toxic. Now, I've called it from the start. She kept saying she wanted strangers, but all of the people who actually would be strangers, she rejected. And she was looking for somebody who she could interact with, who had similar interests, who she would be friends with. And now here we are, nearing the end of the episode, and she is letting her friends move in. That was really what she wanted all along. She was clearly in denial, and I don't even know why she tried. She should have just invited them from the start. Back with Derek, Allison begins to wake up, and Derek welcomes her back. Meredith then walks over to an elevator in her leopard print shoes, where Derek is waiting, and he says that it's intense, this thing he has for ferry boats. After looking at him for a moment, she shakes her head, changing her mind, and says that she's so taking the stairs this time. Derek teases her for having no self-control getting in the elevator, while Meredith takes the stairs and then leaves the hospital, catching up with George, Izzy, and Christina in the parking lot as they head home for the day. Just a nice way to end the episode and wrap everything up with a nice little bow. And now we're at the part of Rewatch and Rank where we do our rankings. We've now rewatched the episode, so we will now rank this episode. We rank under two lists. The first is a mostly objective ranking, mostly objective, because it's absent of emotion, but bias and judgment still apply, so it can't be called completely objective. Then the second list is my personal rankings, which is all emotion. It's entirely based on my opinion and my feelings about the episode and how I felt watching it. All right, so on screen you'll find the mostly objective rank values, and I've highlighted the ones that I feel apply to this episode. So the first thing that applies to this episode, I feel, is that we have our multi-season main character development, and I think that has to do with Izzy. Izzy's personality becomes more shown, and she has a penchant for breaking rules. Because this is a rewatch, we of course know the future, and we know that this is something that becomes a pattern of behavior for her right up until she eventually leaves the show. So this is developing her character and our expectations of the character. I also think that there is the multi-season supporting character development with Richard, who we learn a little bit more of the backstory. We know that he was close with Meredith's mother, that he changed her diapers, is what we learn, and that there's a history there, which again, because we know the future, we know eventually becomes a bit more important. And then we also, in the positives, have the memorable, iconic moment line, event, etc. As I said, one of my favorite lines from the entire series is when Christina tells George not to say another word until after Bambi's mother's shot. I had a brain moment there. But that's an iconic line. That's a really memorable line. And like I said, it's one that I've remembered throughout the entire series as one of my favorite lines in the entire show. So with that, we have +3 for the iconic line and the supporting character development, and then a +4 for the main character development. For the negative sides, I put that there was a failed emotional impact. And this is down to the shoes. I feel like those shoes were meant to get us to hyper empathize with Allison and care very deeply about her status and her waking up. That was kind of their main through line on the patient of that's the patient we're supposed to care about. You know, when she woke up, I think we were supposed to be happy. We were supposed to have some sort of connection to this character, and they were trying to achieve that through having Meredith, who is the main character, a main character, empathize so strongly with her and keep bringing up these shoes and their potential connection and how they get from the baby to the person lying on there. But I just didn't feel it. I thought the shoe thing was weird. I didn't feel really anything for Allison whatsoever. So I feel like they were trying to build us up to caring, and it failed because I didn't care. And that is a -3 points. And then obviously we have our negative messaging or behavior, which is a -2 points. And this, of course, has Meredith stealing the case. But again, I feel like that one's more forgivable. But then we mainly have Izzy going against the policy of the hospital, knowingly, on purpose, knowing she's going to potentially lose her job if it's found out, in order to break hospital rules. And while it is for a moral reason, it's still not an excuse. She is on hospital time. She's using hospital supplies, and she is treating a patient that is not going to be paying for those things. That is genuine theft and against the policies, and she knows it. So that's some very negative messaging, very negative behavior. And that then, with our positives and our minuses, leaves us with a total score of a perfectly average episode of 5 out of 10. So, here are our season 1 rankings so far. We have our mostly objective ranking list, which currently is in episode order. So we have A Hard Day's Night, and now The First Cut is the Deepest falls into second place. On my personal ranking, that remains the same. A Hard Day's Night is in slot 1, and second place, The First Cut is the Deepest. Now, my personal rankings, I really didn't like this episode. It's not the worst one. There are ones that are worse, but it wasn't my favorite. It's nowhere near my favorite. Honestly, I really like Meredith and Derek as a couple, but I don't like that there was all this back and forth. Like, she draws the line, she immediately crosses it, then she denies it. All the back and forth is starting to get annoying. I have low tolerance for slow burn, shall we say, in a relationship. I think if you like somebody, you should then try it out. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. If it does work, it works. But all this back and forth before even becoming a couple, because you're afraid that it might work or might not work, it annoys me. So I don't like that there wasn't really any progression with Derek. I also found that the plot really jumped back and forth a lot. I feel like they took on maybe too many cases, and there was just, a lot of montages, a lot of going back and forth between the characters, a lot of snippet scenes. And then we have all of the questionable behaviors. Questionable behaviors from Meredith, questionable behaviors from Izzy. It's just a lot of questionable behaviors. And then there's also the serious subject matter of the attacker and the victim who was never really fully addressed, apart from the medical side of things and whether or not she would wake up and the wanting us to care and over empathize. But again, failed emotional impact, I didn't really. I thought the shoe thing was weird. So because I know there are worse episodes out there, I gave it a 3 out of 10. But I didn't think it was really great. I did like some of the moments though. I think Christina had a lot of good lines in it. I think that the Meredith Derek thing, even though I am annoyed that there isn't a lot of progression with them, I know where they end up, and I do love their chemistry on screen, so that's where the 3 comes in. But it just overall wasn't a great episode in my opinion. And so now we come to our final thoughts. So this is the series ranking, and so far. Basically, in the series ranking, we rank each season against each other. Because there are far too many seasons and far too many episodes for all of those episodes to be ranked against each other, because by the time we get to season 3, we're going to forget about what episodes were in season 1 and why we liked or disliked them in order to be able to give a meaningful ranking. So the way that it's doing is each season's episodes are ranked against each other, but then each season will get ranked against each season. And the way that we're going to determine which season is better is by creating a percentage from the scores. So there are 8 episodes in season 1, which means that they can score a maximum score of 80 points. In this episode, our mostly objective list gave a rank of 5. And so that moves up the score to 15 out of 80. And on the personal ranking, we've added 3. And that brings the personal ranking up to a score of 9 out of 80. Once we finish the season, we'll find the percentage score for this season. And then as we finish each season following, we will find the percentage scores for each season. And in the end, once all is said and done, we will then know what percentage score each season got, and whichever percentages are higher will be considered the better seasons and be put on this ranking. And with that, we've now rewatched and ranked Grey's Anatomy Season 1, Episode 2, The First Cut is the Deepest. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.